My name is Tyler Rohrbal. I'm Yellowdig's VP of Strategic Partnerships, and I work very closely with my colleague Bob, who I'll pass it to in a minute. Really focused on working with our largest partners, aligning on their needs and the problems they're solving for, and finding ways that our platform and our solutions work together to solve those challenges. And we are so lucky to have Paul and Aanchal from the BU Online MBA team. We'll have them introduce themselves here in a minute, but Bob, why don't you do the same first?
Sure, real quickly. I'm Bob Erdischek. I'm Yellowdig's head of client success. And prior to coming to Yellowdig, I taught for a long time. And in my own teaching, I was always looking for ways to have a better student and, frankly, professor experience. And the tools that the EdTech tools I was using didn't quite do that. So I experimented on my own, and when I found Yellowdig, it's what I had been looking for, and now I work with our partners again to like these fine folks to help them get the most out of our product, out of the Yellowdig learning community. And I guess I can pass it off to Paul.
Thanks, Bob. Again, Paul Carlile. So I work here at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. Have been in a senior dean role for a number of years, developing new programs. The latest one, which is the Online MBA. I'm also a faculty member here. I come at my research from a kind of a knowledge learning point of view. And maybe one thing you'll notice in the slides later on is I'm a firm believer in open innovation. So one way I think about changing education is to make it more of an open innovation platform. So maybe we'll have some conversations about that. All right, to you, Aanchal.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aanchal Singh. I'm Director of Program Innovation here at Boston University's Online MBA. When I first joined, I was actually on the teaching team side as one of the learning facilitators, which is a very unique role. And I think one of the finest opportunities to learn about the OMBA student. My background is in IT and high-tech industries. I'm also BU alum, class of 2017, Questrom MBA. So a lot of BU association there. And right before higher education, I worked for Amazon Alexa, and SolidWorks were actually my most recent two employments. But happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you both. Well, before we get started, just one bit of housekeeping. Do feel free to ask us and our panelists questions. You can use the Q&A space that Zoom provides, and we'll address those either there or in the live discussion. We'll also be moderating the chat space, so feel free to drop any questions or comments there as well. Okay, well, before we dig in too deeply, I'd love to just have you confirm for us, what is the BU Online MBA, and at the highest level, what does that look like? And I'll pull my slides back up here, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. And I thought what we might do is just give you a little bit of kind of the demographics and the students makeup and what the class size is and a few other things. And then maybe we'll go into the vision and where we were coming from. So this is a quick slide around the current cohort that joined in the fall of 22. Probably the most important number here is the 498. So that's a cohort, but a cohort actually is the class size. And I'll reveal that a little bit more. We went after an adult education cohort. So 11 years is the average year's work experience. There's the average age. You also see the companies. Also, it's probably important to look at 32% are international, but that covers 52 different countries. So very global in terms of time zones, et cetera. So that gives you a sense of the target market that we went after. And then maybe I'll talk to you on the next slide, Tyler, a little bit about how we went about this, beginning to think about how this is differently. As I said, we have, each class is between 400 and 500 students. And what we decided to do was to focus on an integrated curriculum. And so we only really have 6 classes that a student takes over the course of their time in the program. You might call them mega courses, so 8 credits apiece. But the purpose here is we decided to focus more around business problems as defined by the business world, versus problems as defined by the academic definition, like accounting or finance or organizational behavior. And so this gives you a sense of the 6 modules which we use. And so these would, to use some expressions, this would be both core and elective, right? The modules are a mixture of core and elective material. And so maybe a little bit later on as we begin to discuss is that once you integrate a curriculum, it affords a lot of new opportunities to go at in terms of how you create conversations. In this case, how do we use Yellowdig support the conversations going forward? So hopefully that gives you a sense of the kind of, when we use the word scale, scale doesn't mean we have 50 different classrooms. Scale means we have 6 classrooms with 400 to 500 apiece. And maybe one question that might come to your mind is, how do I use scale as an advantage versus just scale as volume? And so that's one thing we thought very critically about, is how do we use the scale as a learning advantage along those lines? So.
Thank you. No, very helpful context before we dig in further. What were some of the challenges that you were looking to address in bringing this new program to market, and really what's the vision for the program?
Yeah, and maybe and I've tipped it a little bit, but as you go to the next slide, you know, the question there of the online MBA market was quite crowded when we decided. Historically, that marketplace is takes the existing MBA curriculum, puts it online on average, charges a fair amount for it. We had decided, along with our marketing partner edX, to go after a disruptive price. And so this is why current tuition is $24,000. And so with that came the opportunity to say, again, do I think about this as just a high volume? But I think what we tried to think about this as, our desire was to address the scarcity of quality education in society. So typically, people say, and I love this phrase here, whether you like it or not, it's up to you, is I tend to think that we have artificial scarcity on quality education. And then so the question might be, again, if so, why? So question might be accessibility. So if we put it online, that certainly means people can become educated wherever they're at, particularly for the adult learner. The next thing to make things less scarce would be, how do I make it more affordable? So you could lower the cost by 50%. In our case, we lowered the cost by 80% of our face-to-face program. But often you'll start to see that different programs tend to stop at accessibility, or they stop at affordability. And so for us, we decided to say, but how do we use this opportunity to reimagine education and learning? And so this might get us to the next slide, Tyler, in terms of how we deliberately chose to think about this quite differently. So as I hinted at the beginning, we decided to go after business problems as they exist in the world. And so that's where the themes around the 6 modules, which you saw on the earlier screen. The requirement there, though, is that if we do that, we have to change how academics teach, how they construct assignments, how they think together. And so we had to integrate different disciplines. And so, for example, in our module 2, which is using data to manage performance, there are statistics, there's accounting, there's operations, and there's finance. But notice I didn't use any of those names when we talk about the module for using data to manage performance. So that faculty team works very hard to think about, what are the dashboards that a manager would need as they think about, you know, like accounting thinks about the past, finance thinks about the future, and operations thinks about the present. Now those worlds blend, right? But in a traditional traditional classroom, you'd have to figure out how they blend. You would have to figure out how they integrate. So this is again the sense of the integrated curriculum. And then the big stretch here, which we'll get to deeply around Yellowdig, is this question of, if we have the average age of a learner of 37, how do we use that peer-to-peer network to enhance the learning? So this is where we begin to flip the questions of volume, scale into networks. And how do we think about a learning network, a learning community, and not just a lot of people in a classroom? And so maybe in the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail, and then we're going to take a step back. But in some ways, then we had to be very deliberate. So this is a slightly busy slide, but let's kind of focus right in the middle column. And there it describes weekly learning architecture. So in some ways, we had to think very deliberately. So if you think about the week, we have 3 days before we have a live session. Then we have a live session, which is phase 2. And then we have 3 to 4 days after a live session. So that's, think about, a 7-day week, roughly broken up that way. So if we think about the first part of the week, is where the role of the teaching team is that of expert. That's the traditional way we think about teachers and faculty. And so that's the videos, it's the text, it's the knowledge checks, it's many preparations to say, are you learning the skills, learning the knowledge that you need? And so that's largely driven on a traditional LMS. In our case, we use Blackboard, so there's a lot of supporting technologies there. So a lot of thoughtful design goes into that with faculty, our learning designers, some of which are on this call. But that's that key first phase. And then if we think about the blue level, this is where the teaching team shifts from being expert to becoming facilitators. And so phase 2 happens in the live session, which is on Zoom. And so here the faculty is working with the students to say, have you mastered what you've learned from the expert phase? If we taught you this accounting principle, if we taught you this notion of how do you create and capture value, do you have some sense of mastery? So you're applying it through cases, you're applying it through simulation, various kinds of exercise. So they're there to facilitate, to ensure that you kind of know how to use this stuff. This then gets to perhaps the part that's the most novel thing of what we do, is if we do, phase 1 well, phase 2 well with all the supporting things, then phase 3 is where we begin to, I use the phrase orchestrate learning. What this basically means is the faculty, the teaching team doesn't have to be in the room anymore. This can now happen amongst the peers. And so again, we also, and so this is the primary role where Yellowdig plays a role in allowing people to co-create knowledge. So somebody posts about something in there, I'm from Taiwan, I'm in retail, they may post something from that environment. There may be somebody from retail who lives in Argentina, and they would post something from there. They could discuss what's similar, what's different, those types of things. So in some ways, it's trying to say that the beauty of Yellowdig 2 there is it's completely asynchronous. So the orchestration can happen wherever you're at, and people can catch up on those threads. And of course, we'll get to the details of Yellowdig a little bit more. So this is the deliberate approach which we've taken, that we do every week of every mod. And we'll even show you some health data, or some health of the community data that reveals and helps shows how the students gets used to this. And so they become more deliberate in how they become. And maybe just end with the next slide, Tyler, and this may just kind of a quick summary of where the vision was, is this question here around the primary focus of our vision is, let's focus on business problems as they exist in the world, as they exist in these working professionals' lives. Then the how of it is that last slide. How do we do that? We have weekly architecture. We have the expert facilitator orchestration level. We have the different technologies that support that stack. But our ultimate goal here is, how do we establish a co-creation network amongst our adult learners? That's really our primary task. And maybe I'll end with a kind of not a negative, but often in the world of online, there's a strong push right now to individualize learning, self-paced learning. And that works with certain kinds of skills, that works with certain kinds of learning. In the case of the MBA education, we felt very strongly to push against self-paced, push against individualized, because we feel a co-creation network can provide real-time, customized experiences for our students, particularly if we do the first 2 phases right. So you can kind of see how phase 1, phase 2 prepares them for this kind of experience.
Paul, I kind of want to go back to the slide that Tyler's showing just here.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm sorry?
I said, yeah, go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
You talked about the orchestration and all that, and that, the instructors sort of stay out of that part of it all. And we'll get into the Yellowdig part of it in a bit, but I wanted to focus here on this slide and the wealth of experience and knowledge that your learners bring to the program. I mean, you couldn't have these conversations that we're going to talk about without them, right? I mean, this is what you're sort of getting with the peer-to-peer idea that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think if quickly going to an open innovation metaphor is typically what you begin to realize is most of the expertise to solve your problem exists outside of your organization. So this is clearly saying a lot of the knowledge exists out there. If they were 22-year-olds, they would not have a lot of knowledge about business and these business problems. So we have the luxury, and I'm using the word luxury because of the students we attract. We have a few on the call. I think Brian's on the call, a few others who are on this call, who bring just rich sets of experiences to enliven every phase, right? but in particular, that orchestration phase where we hope we light that up for them, and then they can, teach each other, help each other.
Yeah, the breadth of experience that they all bring to the program
is tremendous.
Yeah, and they learn from each other.
Yeah,
they have the opportunity here to learn from each other, I should say.
And if we have time, we do have some examples of what that looks like in the platform that we've pulled, just so that everybody sees how students are engaging at that level without a tremendous amount of direct facilitation there. Great. Well, I guess sort of transitioning here a bit, let's think about really how Yellowdig fits into then operationalizing this. And Bob, I don't know if you have any questions you want to tee up for Aanchal and Paul.
Well, why don't why don't we just talk about our history, sort of how we got to where we are today. So my role as in client success is to make sure that people are getting the most out of the platform, that they're able to use it effectively, and that they see the value and what works and what doesn't and all that kind of stuff. And in the distant past, 3 years or 2 years or whatever it was, the folks at Boston University OMBA got started. Things didn't go. Aanchal, you want to tell us about that part of the experience, maybe?
Yeah, I think things went perfectly well because we learned a lot from it, right? When you're starting out,
that's the necessary sentiment.
Yeah, because when you're starting out, you often have to lean on what you know. And we knew about traditional discussion board format. So, of course, the very first iteration of Yellowdig at OMBA was highly inspired from that. But we quickly learned what were the limitations and what not to do, right? So we started to make some very intentional shifts. And that's when, Bob, we started to work more and more closely with you and your team, just trying to understand Yellowdig to start with, right? What's the capability? What's the limitation? And now starting to understand Paul's vision and be like, so how do we get started? Number one was when we go back to that old model, we're putting too many directives and constraints, right? Talk about this. There's like fixed prompts to like make X number of comments by this day. But what we did was we completely changed that degree of freedom. We actually increased it for students. So now we provide this fixed list of things, talk about anytime during their full 14-week semester, and whatever is most relevant and current to you, right? So just trying to increase that degree of freedom. And then, of course, there are features such as topics, which help us also keep them within context. So I think just a closer understanding of the product and then using it effectively would be step one. And then number two was looking inwards within our team, right? It has to integrate with the course. Our team has to adopt it. And this is a pretty new way of learning, peer-to-peer engagement in Yellowdig. So we started to look for some early adopters, and we had some faculty members who were there, right? So really just seeing what are they doing that works, that students are responding to. So we started to like standardize that within our teams and then knowledge share across faculty teams. So that kind of helps us also integrate it with the current knowledge that's being shared. So Paul talked about phase 1, 2, and 3, right? So when they come in Yellowdig, it has to connect with phases 1 and 2. And this can be enabled by the people that actually work with students, that's our learning facilitators and the faculty. So them getting on board was very important, and then learning from whatever they were championing. And then finally it's community at scale. We have a lot of students. How do we moderate this? And that's where I think that to me is a learning journey. I think our learning facilitators still consult with Yellowdig team naturally, but it's really about how do you not overly moderate? So they can talk about it, but when do you jump in? When somebody asks a question, should I answer it or should I just comment enough so that it enhances this conversation and someone else comes and responds to it? So just those kind of, that's what I mean by moderation. So we made use of some features that are available, but also every touch point that we have with the student on the platform is very intentional, and we have a lot of conversations around that. That's some of the things.
Bob, if I may jump in and just tie this, we had a great question on the moderation from Gudrun, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the chat. And Aanchal just spoke to the role of the LF, but I think what's more important is that the environment that they're designing is one that shouldn't need a lot of that direct moderation. Like the question in particular was around one or two students like hogging the space or taking advantage of the space. Do you want to maybe speak a little bit to whether those are behaviors you see, or like what are those LFs really doing in the community?
I think number one, this behavior, I think that it's the design, the way the platform is designed. You can't. There's like solid for 7 days to talk about any of the topics, right? We do want students, if someone is talking about something you wanted to talk about, maybe you respond and then think about something else to talk about. And recently we've started to differentiate between conversations that are exploration based versus something you already know, you exploit and enhance. Right. So I think there's a lot of space. And if someone has already said what you wanted to say, I think it's time to say something else. So to me, I think the platform by design kind of discourages one or two people hogging onto. Then there's, of course, the point system. Everybody is going to find something. So I think there's some very sophisticated incentives that help students come in. And number two, I think we kind of talked about the learning facilitators team. We do have 3 to 4 people and sometimes even faculty who go in and read these conversations. What are students talking about? So for example, now we are in a business education space, and Paul, you can jump in here at any point. Let's say a post gets flagged, right? We don't just pull that post away. It's us bringing it back. We're like, for business school, it is important to have difficult conversation. So was it just not said, right? So it's really very intentional. Do you punish or do you meet them and enhance it?
Mm-hmm.
Do you tell them to put it differently? So in my experience, I think all of our team, all of our learning facilitators, it takes a whole village to run this. People actually come back and discuss and often consult with the Yellowdig team. Like, this is what happened. This is what we want. How do we do it?
Yeah, and I think in some ways there's a deliberateness here. Maybe I'll go back to the early days when Tyler and I first talked 3.5 years ago. Was Yellowdig at the time, from my perspective, was kind of a passive communal support tool, right? And it had a really good role, particularly more so in undergraduate. Of course, we had these adult learners who know a lot. And so our first thing was to use it, but then to be maybe too deliberate. We pinned the topics, right? And so that was, I think Evelyn made the comment, too much structure kills, right? So what's that? So what you've seen this, we found a sweet spot where you need some structure, but not too much structure. And I guess I'm going to use a fuzzy word, is self-monitoring, but more importantly, self-organizing. I really see a lot of self-organizing. So again, if you get phase 1, phase 2 right, in the topics, I teach in Mod 1. So we have a topic, 15 topics, and we have open-ended topics, but it's related to the big problem that Mod is focused on, which is creating value for business and society. That's a gigantic topic. And so in some ways, you have enough guardrails to focus that, and then the self-organizing can work. Because I think that's something everybody probably in the call says, what's the right amount of structure for the self-organizing? Because if there's too much, it shuts it down. If there's not enough, then there's not enough to connect together. Then it feels like a free-for-all. So I think this is this thing that we're all trying to find.
And
your phases. Yeah, Bob, go ahead. I wanted to tee you up here because I think those phases align really beautifully with our underlying pedagogy. And Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, so what I wanted to clarify for folks in the audience who may or not be familiar with Yellowdig isn't a discussion board. And so one of the challenges that we face early on is sort of having the teams that we're working with understand the shift that what we want to do is really emulate the community of inquiry framework and take the strengths of that, allowing learners to have a social presence, to share the what they find relevant from the course concepts, to allow those conversations to ebb and flow with what they need and what they have to share, with them as far as that goes. So Yellowdig, unlike a discussion board, isn't a prescriptive, this is what you talk about now, and this is all that you talk about now. And I think that's challenging as we start with new people sometimes, as far as that goes. And, there was a question in the chat that I'm trying to find again. Tyler, if you have it handy, can you just reread that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it ties to a lot of this that we're touching on here, which is like we're creating the environment with high agency in a very interdisciplinary curriculum, where yes, there's teaching presence, but the students are expected to come in, with their own perspective and build on that. A question for both of you: how are you ensuring that learning is happening in the asynchronous time? Maybe speak to either data that you're looking at or the things the LFs are trying to observe in the community. I think that will really help contextualize.
Maybe I'll take a quick stab, Aanchal, and of course, as a faculty member teaching in it too, I spend a fair amount of time on Yellowdig, and so I might get even posted. So Paul Carlile, come and listen to this, so that I can go to those things too. But when Yellowdig, or this sweet spot, which is supported by Yellowdig, because this is the thing, this community of inquiry we're trying to get to, is that the other thing too is that for those of you who are new to Yellowdig, the points are even between posts, potentially between posts and comments. So it's really the conversation that you're trying to get. That's another big step away from, so think of that more like Reddit if you're in kind of in that environment. And so the goal here is a conversation will start, but it's really the things that flow. And so a simple thing when it's at its best is you'll see a post and then you'll see comments, and people will start to identify that, well, we're all so different from each other. Again, you're in retail, I'm in banking, you're in Taiwan, I'm in Oklahoma. But what starts to happen over time is within that thread is they start to realize, yeah, we're different, but 80% of the thing we worry about are the same in regards to the topic. Say the topic is on, quality operations. Let's say that's the topic they're talking about. They start to realize that even though we're in retail and banking, there's so much similarity. And see that's what, your fundamental desire as a faculty, as an educator, is for people to identify what's common so you can understand that, and then what's circumstantial. And so I think that's one of the things we look at. So, the questions of a surety of learning, you almost have to get back to the question, do you trust the network? Do you lay enough track? And maybe I'll say one more thing, Aanchal, is that inquiry of learning, a lot of that literature, I read a lot of that literature, but the challenge of an inquiry of learning is, what does it start its inquiry around? And so this is why we do business problem focus. So we hand up the problems to them. So we're all going to be working a problem. And then the different topics are sub pieces of that problem. And so if they have a shared problem and a way to talk about it, and then we give them a common language from the expert phase, we give them common methods to talk about those problems in phase 1 and phase 2. When they go to this orchestration level, they have the skills they need to work together. And so there you begin to trust their ability to help each other get to better knowledge, not that I have to be there. So again, if I was to measure it all, if I was to be present, it would all shut down or it would become too constrained. So, Aanchal?
No, I think you summed it up pretty well. To answer your question, I will say a lot of it is anecdotal. Yes, we have data points, we have direct student feedback that certainly helps us assess improvement over time, or at which point this becomes even more important to them is when they explicitly say like, oh my God, this week was really hard. And I found a lot of supplemental materials from my class on Yellowdig, right? So we do have those very specific items. We can look at some metrics to look at health scores, engagement. And when we're analyzing, we actually look at it against what are they studying this week? Were there any assignments? Do you see something of extension being discussed here? Right, but a lot of it is definitely anecdotal. And like Paul said, he actively teaches in the mod. So I think he's the best person to answer it. Like faculty, if they go and spend time, they will actually see it for themselves.
It can be very humbling, actually, to watch these conversations, because there's just a lot of knowledge, a lot of sophistication out there. So, and maybe I'll just say, is my humility as a professor who's supposed to know things is, many of the conversations that get created, it would be hard for me to generate those conversations because I don't have knowledge about X, Y, and Z. But once you see it transpire amongst the network, then you can make comment that adds value, but you couldn't have created the business context, the problem context. And that's what's truly humbling to watch.
Absolutely.
So Tyler just brought up one of the slides that shows some redacted conversations from the OMBA community. This is, I believe, Mod 4, the assessing risk. Is that right, Aanchal?
Yeah.
Yeah. And, to sort of demonstrate some of the things that you sort of said here, these students are bringing in their own experiences, and they're not having a prescribed conversation. This is a student-generated conversation. If you can see at the top, there are a number of these little tags at the top. Those are our topic tags, and they are how conversations are shaped in Yellowdig. And this particular learner saw how these 4 particular topics work together, and brought that in by using all the topics so people can find those conversations related to that. But what I love about this personally is that you can see that we've highlighted that these students are finding ways to disagree with each other respectfully and have deeper conversations about what's going on in the community. And is this an uncommon thing in your communities, Aanchal?
Not at all. I think that's exactly what Paul was pointing to. Is when you look at these conversations, they almost are enlightening. Sometimes examples you wouldn't think of.
Tying it back to that ultimate goal of knowledge co-creation, notice that Paul and Aanchal are not talking about assessment or grading in the context of Yellowdig's value here. There was a question in the chat about how Yellowdig interacts with a grade book. And I do just want to quickly highlight that you can use the point system that we've been referencing to measure and quantify that. And maybe, Aanchal, if you can speak to what that looks like. But as you can clearly see, audience, the goal is not that they're rigidly grading this, but instead providing, the ecosystem for this kind of participation to happen. Aanchal, I don't know if you want to speak explicitly to that grading piece.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, you can integrate it with the LMS and pull over these points, scale it to whatever point value you need. But to me, I think what's more important is understanding the point system within Yellowdig. And of course, you have spent time educating us, and we have spent time learning about it, right? How many points you put, I can adjust the cadence I want in my platform. Maybe students are having a difficult week, right? It's a lot of material to study, so I can adjust that cadence. Maybe this week you get a lighter Yellowdig week. Those kind of things. So there's a way. So what's really powerful to me about Yellowdig points is, number one, it takes care of a non-issue issue. Will student participate? Yes, they will, because they need the points. Good. So now the whole conversation is, how do we make it valuable to them? And that's what makes it even more challenging and interesting at the same time, right? And we do these little tweaks around the points. We learned about value per word said, which again can be adjusted based on points. We have a very interesting health metric called conversation ratio, right? Which shows responses per comment, because that's the back and forth is the engagement. And all this, I think, can be tweaked using points, which sounds like a perfect segue into your slide.
I just want to add that the point system in Yellowdig is not a summative assessment tool. It is a motivational tool. It's designed to get learners earn points for creating content, but they also earn points for the interactions that they receive from others. So if they're creating content that's valuable to the community, they're going to get to their point goals a little bit easier as far as that goes.
And maybe as we dive into this, Bob, is, we do have plenty of other assignments. So in some ways those are kind of in the phase 1, phase 2. The assignments also happen in phase 3 because they might turn in their assignments toward the end of the week. So, and we have faculty and designers who spend a lot of time to construct those assignments. So in some ways, that's where we're looking for more of the traditional surety of learning measures.
Mhm.
But again, if you go with one of the almost first slides is, are we creating artificial scarcity to learning and knowledge creation in our society, right? And so if you think about here, if I had to turn everything into assignment, everything into something graded, this whole layer would get shut down. This orchestration layer would get shut down. And so part of that is we do a lot of the stuff so they can get there in a very organized, informed fashion, but we have to not turn that into an assessment, because you put artificial constraints on it.
Yeah. I think another way, something I just like to add is how I see the role Yellowdig plays in that is also quality. We say we are quality at scale, right? Well-rounded education to me is also that is relevant, right? There's a lot I can learn from my course materials, my assessments, but for me, it's useful if I can take it and use it and apply it. And to me, Yellowdig is sort of an enabler. It allows us to enable that, right? You can take it and now start having conversations around it, and explore that relevance to your professions.
Yeah, and the strength of our students with all that experience is they're discussing it on Yellowdig, but they're also potentially applying it in their workplace as we speak. So again, that's the luxury we have of this kind of group. And maybe just quickly with this slide is these are some comparisons between Module 1 and Module 2. So the key thing here is Module 1 happens at the very beginning. And so we see more posts than we do in Mod 4. That's something we would expect. People are learning the tool, they're posting, but there's also more comments in Mod 4 than there are in Mod 1. So you see the ratio shift. They're learning it. They're getting better at those longer conversations. So this is kind of an indicator of how they get better at this. But in some ways, both of these sets of data here suggest a very healthy community. But the behaviors are just slightly different, kind of the phase, maybe even some of the topic. But I think these are very positive health markers, the things that we look at to ensure that.
Just so people are looking at this know what they're looking at, that conversation ratio is the number of comments relative to the number of posts. In the standard post once, comment twice discussion board, you're going to see a number of 2. But here we see that it really measures conversation depth, that conversations are going much deeper, the students are staying much more involved in what's happening, that they're reading what each other post and they're learning from each other.
Absolutely. Well,
that's like magic.
Yeah, I mean, conversation ratios this high, we have partners that are striving to get there. So it is quite impressive to see really across all of your mods how the students are taking advantage of this opportunity. I just want to acknowledge there's a number of really great questions that have come in both in the chat and in Q&A. And Paul and Aanchal, I'll surface them here to you. And then we'll save some time to think about maybe what are some relevant next steps and some of the key differences that you see between our partnership and others. But maybe first on the faculty side. So Peggy is asking a question around, now in particular, she's thinking about a DNP program, but they find that there's some faculty that are really on board with Yellowdig on day one and others that are maybe not so open to this paradigm. How do you address that? And what are the ways that you've used, to educate faculty to Yellowdig's value?
And maybe I think Ken too is asking a similar question. Hey Ken, how are you?
Yes.
I think so. In some ways, that little upside down wedding cake picture on that one slide, I use that to educate the faculty in their role. Because in some ways, partly you might say, well, does faculty feel like they're giving up control? Because historically speaking, the faculty controls everything in the classroom, right? They are truly the expert. They arbitrate 90% of everything that happens, right? But by helping them see that, first of all, in this environment, they can't be everywhere. In some ways, this is where the question of scale kind of rocks their world, right? It rocks their world. I have to think differently. But in some ways, that expert facilitation orchestration is a way for them to think about it. And they see what they do at the phase 1, helps with the phase 2 and what they do in the phase 2, which is the live, where they're really, really important in the live phase. But that sets up for this kind of orchestration to happen. So in some ways, you have to give them their own vision, their own roadmap. And then they have their own sense of humility when they watch these conversations. And then in some ways, you've grown an extra, version of who you are as an educator. You say, I can educate that way as well. And I don't have to be in the room. What a beautiful thing. Because if I have to be in the room every time, it limits what can happen.
Yeah. And after you share that, just to follow up, after you share that vision, you look for your champions. You just need 2 or 3 of them to adopt and demonstrate. At least that's what we did. And then start to knowledge share across bonds.
Bob, I know you have a lot of experience with this as well. Anything that you want to add?
It's as someone who was in the classroom myself for a long time, giving up what we perceive as control and making sure that our students are focusing on the right things is a huge challenge in moving to something like Yellowdig. But the outcomes are so exciting, and you end up learning from your students, and that they're finding more ways to get what they need here than if you're just letting them know what they can talk about and when they can talk about it. I think is one way that I would sort of put it there.
Yeah.
I know we don't have a ton of time left, but one thing I would really like to address, because it's been one of the highlights of my employment at Yellowdig in the 3 years that I've been here, is the relationship that we have working together. We used to meet bi-weekly. I think that's pretty unique for an ed tech company with an institution to sort of, Aanchal, why don't you just speak to that a little bit and talk about how that works?
I think just like you said, I think the number one thing was you were always available. The team was always available. You showed that you cared to help us. You have shown openness to understanding what we wanted to do and how, with Paul's wild visions and dreams, you didn't scare away. You were here to let's understand, look at our product roadmap and what do we need to do to get there. So to me, the team has almost been a thought partner. And in the early stages, because we're doing something new and so are you, I think we shared a lot of knowledge and you educated us in your platform. So I think that time was really what helped us almost reset our foundation, right? And we continue to work with your team. Like you said, our teaching team meets with you still to consult over little issues, big issues. So I think that form of partnership has been very, very essential and held us. And like Paul earlier said, right, open innovation, it's not just innovation. We need partners who are open to trying something different. So yeah, that has been essential.
And I think it goes both ways. I mean, we've learned from you. Hopefully you've learned a little from us. And, like I said, it's a joy. I look forward to our now monthly meetings because I know I'm going to learn something that's going to be helpful to other partners that we have that we work with as well. I hope you don't mind that we're doing that. But it's a different kind of relationship that I've had otherwise outside of. So I appreciate that and appreciate all of you.
I couldn't agree more, Bob. It's been a lot of fun. And just the mutual understanding that we don't know what we don't know. So we're going to try it. We're going to look at the data. We're going to understand what that data tells us and then iterate from there. We want to see more of that in higher education partnerships. And as a company that really believes we are an outcomes-driven company, we're not just a technology. It's great to see that embraced by folks like yourselves.
And
here, Aanchal, did you? I just want to very quickly, I know we have 10-ish minutes left. There's a couple questions we are going to get to that have come in, but I wanted to let Aanchal and Paul expand there if they had anything else to add.
Yeah, I mean, let's get to the questions. I guess you had the one to Natalie around.
Yeah, I wanted to. Yeah, do you want to maybe read that aloud, Paul, and then address it if you'd like?
I think it went down on my screen, but it's something to the fact
I
that
have it here. So,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so this is a question from Natalie from UCI Mirage. Curious, based on your 3 phases architecture, when does formal assessment of learning mastery occur? After orchestrate or that Yellowdig asynchronous space, or before, or both?
So let me actually go at the question, take a step back from it, because in some ways, the reason why it's in the weekly architecture, because at some point it can happen all over the place, right? And so what it does is there's plenty of knowledge checks, there's plenty of assignments that are solo, that are team, that are manually graded, some are auto graded. So Caroline's on the call. She's one of our designers. She works with faculty to do this. So these are positioned at various areas. So in some ways, it's a little bit like there's not a clear, it's very recursive, right? And so, which also means we don't have to, which allows us to allow those more traditional assessments to exist on their own and do their job as proving mastery and grades. And we can allow the Yellowdig to do what it does best. But these things are happening. So there, for example, there might be a small thing you would not need to fill out before you enter the live session, because you're going to have a debate on who's going to win the voice words of AI, right? Or something like that. Mm-hmm. So you would fill something out. So am I participating? Have you framed the problem the right way? So we have these things that exist at any point in time, but this is just a gross way to think about the overarching design goals of the thing. So hopefully that's a good enough answer. So they're not segregated. And technically they're happening the orchestration is potentially then happening all the time. Potentially all the time.
Yeah.
I pulled that back up as well. There's another question in here I think a lot of folks are wondering, not just in this environment, but ChatGPT comes up a whole lot these days. How do you expect, if at all, ChatGPT to impact this model that you've built out?
So actually ChatGPT is most afraid of Yellowdig, right? Of anything we do, because typically when you're seeing the really good conversations, everything is timely and relevant and ripped from the headlines. And again, that's the beauty of relying on the network, right? Because they bring that contemporaneous, relevant, up-to-date stuff. And so it's really hard for ChatGPT. Maybe we can think about a few years hence, it may be easier. But also the things that ChatGPT struggles with is, this is why you can always, when you read it, it always gets a C+ answer, right? Is because it often lacks the details of when and who and why. And really the purpose of Yellowdig, the way we try to get the students to engage it, is the when matters, the who matters, and the why matters. Traditional assessments, which are more what, if there are traditional what assessments, that's where I would worry much more about ChatGPT. So again, we got to watch it, we got to evolve and things like that, but it's the least place that I worry about than anything else we do.
Melanie, who's one of our go ahead, Aanchal, and then I'll surface this comment.
I was just going to actually say what Paul said with using different words. Is I think ChatGPT is great for something like this, because while it takes care of the what conversations, we can now talk more. We can explore it.
Yeah.
It's sort of hard to use ChatGPT to participate in an actual conversation, even though that's what it's based on. You're not going to go and drag your Yellowdig thread to ChatGPT and come up with something that so it really isn't. There's not an opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, even if you do, I think our UMBA students will handle it. They're brilliant.
Yeah, there's an intimacy that there's an intimacy that happens on the thread. And then intimacy are the things that ChatGPT would have a really hard time. And what you also begin, I talk to students when they come to open houses, et cetera. And a lot of them find each other on Yellowdig. It's like, boy, Bob, your answers are just always so thoughtful and measured, even when I disagree with you, right? Even when it's because I learned something from it. And so what you start to see is it's a place for them to find their dense networks, right? Because you have a big network, right? And I think that's because, and that's where ChatGPT would be pure subterfuge and or camouflage to that process. You're going to ask something, Tyler.
Conversation. No. I just wanted to highlight our partners at the Geese College of Business. Melanie highlighted this. They're doing some A/B testing around this, and the findings are about what we would expect based on this discussion.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing, Melanie. That's nice to see that we're both seeing the same thing.
Well, this has been such a fun conversation, and trust me, there was so much we could cover today. We knew we had limited time, so if you do have any additional questions here in the last moments for Aanchal and Paul, feel free to drop them in here. Bob, are you seeing any that I should surface?
There was one question about class size, about, what is the upper limit and all that kind of stuff. And I think we're talking to the people who really have the most experience with huge Yellowdig communities. On that one slide, what did it say? Average is how many learners in each mod?
It's probably averages about 425. Our fall intakes are larger than our spring intakes, but I'd say 420. As on average.
And, are you finding this number of students to be a problem in Yellowdig?
Well, I think it is, when you think about Mod 1, which is where they're learning, and again, the topic of Mod 1 is very broad. And so they're learning, okay, topics. Can I pin a topic? How do I do hashtags? How do I do the @ sign? And, we've talked about filters, and search features. I think for those of you who are new to Yellowdig, it's not the first thing you're going to play with, but I would encourage you to think about how do you play with the search functions and the filters sooner. And then the question is, how do you offer those as tutorials to the students? I'll just, we offer tutorials to students, but what's interesting is the students also use Yellowdig to teach each other how to use it. Again, so that's where a large network, is more likely to struggle with search, or struggle with filtering. But a large network is more likely to have people who are motivated to provide the answer and put screenshots and say, and then it builds the network. Hey, Bob, you answered my question. Next time I'm going to answer your question if I have the time. So that's
scale is an advantage. Just tying
scale
it back
is an advantage.
But
you got to be ready for it. But then it becomes unintended positive consequences, or to use a fancy term in our Mod 1, is it becomes a positive network effect because they can teach each other, they can help each other. But I think one thing, though, I feel strongly about to say, though, is you do have to lay foundations for this to work. A shared problem, shared language, shared methods, and then that self-organizing can happen. And I think that's been our journey together from the original days. And that we've gotten, because I do think this question of I think Evelyn had this question of motivation. She's obviously does research in this area, but propositional motivation. For me, I'm an anthropologist, so I think about the world not as a cognitive problem. I think about the world as what's a shareable problem. And so if you can construct shared problems, have that be the starting point, then the motivation is going to be there. Then the desire to learn the methods, learn the languages there. So that's kind of how hopefully that would agree, Evelyn, with that. But that's kind of how I approach it. The shared problem is very important. So, community of inquiries don't exist unless there's a problem, right? Or ability to start framing a problem. That's kind of why we, back to the original vision of OMBA.
But I think you hit the nail on the head. Sort of setting expectations with your instructors, your learning facilitators, and your students as you're starting is key to success. Is one thing that we definitely learned together, I think, Aanchal.
Yeah, it's definitely like, I just want to say it's a learning journey. I think we are just getting better at it. And we haven't stopped working. I think we have to keep going. That's where we're delving more into what are these different types of conversations, what topic generates what kind of conversation. So I think it's definitely a job still being done, but we're making progress. That's where I'm at.
Well, thank you both so much for your time today, your expertise, your insights, and thank everyone in the audience for all of your great questions and your comments throughout the webinar today. Just to maybe suggest some next steps here. I know there were some questions more around how Yellowdig works, less so how they were using it, and we intentionally didn't address those today because we do have a webinar. Unfortunately, you're stuck with Bob and I again, but it is next Tuesday afternoon if you want to come and see more of Yellowdig and the platform itself. And I believe our team is going to drop a link in the chat if that hasn't already happened, and I imagine it has. Yep. So if you want to stay in touch with our panelists and the OMBA program at BU, there's links to do so. Bob, any final parting words from you?
If anyone's interested in this kind of thing, looking forward to working with you. Let's put it that way. And we will try to have the same kind of consultative relationship, collegial relationship, I guess I would say, that we have with Aanchal and Paul and their teams.
It's been a great experience working with your team. It's been great. And Brian too.
Everyone.
Brian was here at the early days. I know he's on the chat, but Brian was here in the early days too. But the three of you, we've worked very closely together.
Yes, and anyone that wants to talk about ChatGPT and follow up, Brian, I think, wrote a really wonderful piece that summarizes some of the things we talked about in this area. So maybe one of us will throw that in the chat here as we close out.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.